This is an experimental series called What If, where I take a game and I reimagine aspects of it to see what different paths it could have taken. I am spoiling the following games to a certain extent, and I'm spoiling all of Bendy and the Ink Machine. If you don't care or are familiar with the games, then go right on ahead. You have been warned. Bendy and the Ink Machine was one of those big blips, but quickly seemed to fade after it finished. The chapter releases kept everyone on their toes as it exploded in popularity. The fandom came out with so many different AUs and ideas, and even original songs based off the new indie game. It felt like Five Nights at Freddy's, but it didn't last nearly as long. I wish to express that I don't hate Bendy, and I love the aesthetic it was going for. The music and the animation style was one that ticked my boxes and drew me in, but as it progressed, the overall story started to get more messy. However, I will applaud the devs for going back to old chapters and reworking them as development went on so that they looked better and better. The original Chapter 1 and the Chapter 1 we have right now are night and day. But when Chapter 5 was released, I couldn't help but see a lot of problems as a finished product. Problem 1! The chapters don't flow well into one another. We follow Henry, a former animator at Joey Drew Studios, in his return to the old studio at the behest of Joey Drew himself. In each chapter is a different section of this endless studio. As a result, there's very little cohesion between each chapter. At the end of Chapter 1, Henry is passing out in the room in the summoning circle after running away from Bendy. Chapter 2 is running into Boris after running away from Bendy. Chapter 3 ends after an elevator crash after not actually nice Alice Angel betrays you for Boris. Chapter 4 ends with Henry getting saved by Alice and Angel as she stabs the fake Alice through the chest. Chapter 5 ends with being a huge disappointment. The point being is that we're always jumping ahead to where the next chapter starts. There's a sense of time progressing when we start the next chapter, and that takes one out of the experience. Now, time jumps aren't a bad thing, but it happens between every chapter, and it jumps way too far. This is a survival horror game, and it sucks the tension out of the narrative when it's implied that Henry hung out with Boris or Allison for what feels like longer than it should. The sense of urgency is lost in the shuffle. I get that this game was released chapter by chapter, but that's when you need to take greater care with how this flows overall. Now, you can have time jumps and still keep the tension high. The Beast Within, a Kickstarter game that came out in 2019, has each chapter begin with both protagonists waking up somewhere different than where they started. But the tension is rarely at a low because something is constantly there to put you on edge, and the time jumps have a thematic and plot-important purpose, which I will not spoil here. This sort of thing is understandable when each chapter was made one at a time and released over the period of about 2 years. This whole video is coming from the benefit of hindsight. Game development is difficult, and indies can sometimes have a much more difficult time getting everything just right. Now, I want to propose ideas that doesn't change too much of the original product because in case of Bendy, I wouldn't make any radical changes. I propose that there are different protagonists for each chapter. With each chapter feeling like they are their own bite-sized stories rather than one cohesive narrative, having someone else at the helm can make this more of a strength rather than a negative. Now, the connections between 3 and 4 wouldn't actually need to be tweaked, as you'll see here in a second. The overall chapters don't need to be changed much at all. I will touch on this later, but because Henry barely has any relevance to the plot as Henry and not just being the protagonist who has to go through everything, having different employees at Joey Drew Studios being the ones to have to deal with each chapter gives a chance to flesh out some of the NPCs we come across in audio tapes. Having some more people who suffer at the deranged arrogance of Joey Drew could add more suspense. For Chapter 1, I would keep Henry as the protagonist. The first chapter by itself in its current state works, and it's probably the strongest chapter aside from aspects of Chapter 2. Chapter 2, I would have someone that works closely with Sammy in order to get more tension and meaning out of the end of the chapter when he is killed by Bendy. Chapter 3 could be Allison being forced to work for Not Alice Angel and get kidnapped at the end of the chapter, and have Tom be the protagonist of Chapter 4 trying to get her back. The Monster Boris could still be the boss fight, and Allison could still kill the not real Alice. This in particular would work because Susie was obsessed with being Alice, and having the actual voice actress be the one under her thumb increases the drama of the situation. In Chapter 5 could very well be Henry again to make everything come full circle to have a confrontation with Joey. By having the connections there, we would inherently be more invested in the stories as we went along. While the overall narrative is connected, Stories Untold does this similarly. Each section is a vastly different gameplay loop, but still sucks you into the mechanics and what's going on. Problem 2. Remove the combat. So I don't think we have to argue about the state of the combat in Bendy. It's a bit clunky at best and annoying and frustrating at worst. The worst offender being Chapter 3 at the end, where you have to fight a gauntlet of enemies. What this does is take the horror out of the experience. It changes the monsters to be things that can be defeated, aside from the Ink Demon himself. I'm not unaware of the survival horror genre, and I have a weird adoration for Resident Evil 7, so I'm not ignorant enough to say that the combat in horror games never works, because it does. But the problem comes in is that it's a nuance in how the gameplay loop progresses. Back up, wait, swing, back up, repeat. Hope that you don't die. Five Nights at Freddy's 2 is a great example of having no combat, but very limited ways to defend yourself. You'll have your flashlight and your Freddy mask, and that's it. You'll have to be smarter and not brute force something. The combat sucks the horror aspect of this game right out of it. The solution's simple. Just remove it. Focus more on the stealth aspects of the game. Or if you wanted limited ways to defend yourself, have a bucket filled with water or acetone that can be refilled that can stun lesser enemies that you run into. If you can't kill the creatures patrolling around, the more the player has to be on edge and to be careful. Also, just remove all the combat from Chapter 2. Just all of it. It ruins arguably the best chapter in the game because you have to whack things to death. The bit where more Bendy cutouts appear as you travel back and forth from the projector is great, and it's clear that you're being watched by something or someone, but you never know who. But it's ruined when you throw enemies in there. Problem 3. The philosophical ending. I'm no stranger to philosophical endings or games. I love Bioshock. But the clear shoving in of whatever they were trying to say was irritating. Now, it's okay if this doesn't have a happy ending. Horror games frequently don't. It's fine. But there really wasn't anything that led up to or reinforced this philosophical narrative it was going for. We all know this was all a story by Joey Drew and is telling it to his niece from the post-credits scene, and the game itself is a loop. Assuming that this was all to an extent real, it's about one man's arrogance going too far and that's bad or whatever because he never atones for his sins. But Joey is barely in this game, aside from the ending and the occasional audio diary. The final confrontation with Bendy was fine, but it could have been better handled. So if the team wanted to keep this theming in there, it should have been reinforced more throughout the entire game and not just throughout the audio diaries about how Joey Drew is a bad person. The closest we get is Chapter 4 and 5 with the amusement park carnival thing and the ink people, and that's really not enough, honestly. Sure, you can say that something being messed up is Joey's fault, and it probably is, but something doesn't click, something's missing, and this could just be a personal issue, but let me see if I can put it into words. Bioshock has in-the-universe philosophy given to you from the moment once you step into the bathysphere, and Andrew Ryan's presence is felt everywhere, not just with the audio logs. Later, you have a confrontation with Ryan himself, and his philosophy is still present. You see the effect it has. People going crazy on drugs, corrupting them, others feeling like they've been cheated so they're going behind his back and trying to rise up. It's dilapidated because people don't have to take care of it or they've gone crazy. You see why regulation is a good thing in the real world. Inside is also another good example of the message being clear. It's about control and what it means to be in control. Everything is themed around it, from the mind control helmets to everyone in general being brainwashed in some way. The secret ending results in the boy unplugging a cord and he slumps over, further commenting on the agency and what that means. It gets better, but that's totally fine by me. If this wanted to keep the ending that it did, then the theme should have been better hinted at. The confrontation with Joey, whether or not it leads to a happy ending, would reinforce what the team was trying to convey. Or have small bits to the effect of a record skipping where you have to replay tiny bits a couple of times spaced out to confuse the player and reinforce the theme of cycles. But only a few times to not annoy the player. Like if you have to put in a mechanism, you put it in and then you're teleported 10 feet back in front of it and you have to put it in again and then that's it. Nothing more than that, and only roughly like 3 times total, otherwise it gets irritating. Henry should also matter as the protagonist if he stays the main protagonist. Either we see more of his inner conflict aside from his bare-bones interactions with the other characters, or Henry's inflection and his line delivery is changed to reflect that he is more than just the run-of-the-mill protagonist. It doesn't have to be much. We know he's an animator for the studio and he left for some reason. Maybe having a more concrete reason and exploring that would make Henry more than just cardboard, and would and could tie into the theming. There is a sequel announced for this year in 2020 as of time of scripting, and I hope it's better, but we'll see. I can only hope that the magic isn't explained. I don't want to know how the ink creatures were created or how Susie or Sammy were corrupted with the ink. I just want what's best for the studio because I wanted this original game to be so good. But when the fandom comes up with things I find more appealing with the same property, it's disappointing. Thank you guys for watching and supporting. Hit that bell, hit that subscribe button if you do so desire. I have a Patreon link down below and my Twitter if you like to see what I'm doing on a daily basis. And so I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.